Okay, hello everybody, and thank you all for joining this Kickstart event of Kathmandu Community Chapter. And a big thanks to Kelsey for managing time this early morning, and we are super excited and super pumped up to have you. And I would say like some of us even didn't believe that you're coming. They're just asking me on Facebook, is that a real thing? So yeah,
It's definitely real.
yeah, it's definitely real, Kelsey. So yeah, and looking forward to this new community. We expect more collaboration from all of you. And without further ado, Kelsey himself is here, but I just want to share a tweet from him, which he did like 2 weeks ago. This gave me a real chill and allergies, I'll say, because that's where we all came from, and that's where we all like came from. So I just want to go through a few slides from where we start. So this was we started this as the first event while initiating the community. This was not a meetup; we called it a meeting. So I think most of us were there 2 years ago are already here. So this was how we started, and we have coming up to this point in 2 years, about 2 years. We have conducted different meetups and different kinds of sessions, workshop and events, so all of those things. So expecting the support, more of the support and more of the collaboration from all of you. And yeah, let's just start with the words from Kelsey, because I don't want to spend more time in that. So I would phrase Kelsey as a good human being. We would like to share, and we would like to help community grow. Let's hear about him from him himself. So Kelsey, can you give us a brief of who we are and what you're doing these days, and also in this COVID world, so how the life is changing? So yeah.
Yeah, so I'm Kelsey Hightower. I think a lot of people know me for my work in the Kubernetes space, maybe with the CNCF. But my career probably starts about, I don't know, 16, 17 years ago. System administrator, doing things inside of data centers with Linux. I used to work at a company called Puppet Labs, doing the whole configuration management thing when that was big in 2012. And throughout that time, I've had, lots of jobs where I've worked for big enterprises where things are not as fast as some of the startups. I've also worked as a software engineer, as a manager, as a product manager, and a lot of open source contributions. So during this COVID-19, of course, I can't get on planes and travel and fly around the world, but a big part of my job is doing product work. So that continues. I work on a lot of the serverless stuff internally. So the things I'm excited about are things like Cloud Run and serverless, the whole serverless container movement, things without Kubernetes. And then also, I'm also working on, maybe it will be a new book, but maybe it'll be something like Service Mesh the Hard Way. But basically, how to think about all of this service mesh from the ground up, whether it's TLS mutual auth, open policy agent, dealing with things like JOT tokens, federated identity. I think for a lot of people in the Kubernetes world or dealing with containers, this is kind of the next level for them. It's dealing with all of this network policy, all of this config. After working on this for a little while, writing a bunch of code, it feels way more complicated than even Kubernetes is, right? Because all of these layers of identity, security, policies, route management. So I think I'm trying to simplify that for people. So if I can show people how it all works from the ground up, I think that would be a good addition to something like Kubernetes the Hard Way or Kubernetes up and running.
Yeah, that's super exciting. And some of you, if you haven't gone through the Kubernetes hard way, it's a hard way. It's on the title, but I can see I've made it a super like convenient and easy for understanding how the internal of the Kubernetes work. So I just want to show this image, so how far we are, just for giving Kelsey an idea of where we actually are. So you can say like between India and China. Yeah. So So, and we have a few questions from ranging from the containers to careers to the communities and all of those things. But if you want to add questions, just feel free to write your questions in this URL. Just go to slido.com and enter the code. So let me start. We have a few of the collection of the questions. So I think in lots of the meetups with the keynotes and all of those things, you seem to like pretty motivated, and there are lots of ideas which you can share with the people ranging from the starting to the like the expert level. So what would you take as a motivation for that, for sharing with the communities and for the growing the communities also?
Yeah, so when I give a keynote, or if you see me give a technical presentation, typically it's the thing that I'm working on, right? So typically I'm not just trying to find something cool just to show something. Sometimes it's going to be, I've been working on this thing for a few months. I have a keynote coming up. Maybe I want to show people what I'm thinking. Maybe I want to show people what I'm working on. So that's usually my motivation for any of these technical presentations or doing meetups. And then on the community side, that's just a natural way to be, right? Like if you're working on these things, you're building these things. And since I work in the open source so much, it just makes sense to kind of to work with the community to understand where all the new ideas are, because new ideas are all over the world, right? Not just in the US, but everywhere. So the community work allows me to learn as well. So when I travel or I meet new people or participate in different Slack channels, I'm typically learning something from a different community. So to me, the community work is like just being a human being, right? We deal with other human beings, we work with them, we learn from them. So to me, community is kind of a natural, probably one of the more interesting pieces of the job. You actually get to talk and work with the people that hopefully you're building things for, and that you're using things that they've built.
Yeah, that's super exciting. And talking about because we are initiating this cloud native chapter, so you have been engaged with the CNCF from the beginning, and you were also in the technical oversight committee for I think about a year. So can you share about like what was the motive behind starting the CNCF and how it is changing over the time, because there are lots of projects and with the lots of projects with the lots of companies engaging in it. So how the things have shifted from the starting of the CNCF to up to now?
Yeah, so a little bit of history. I don't think I played a major role in the creation of the CNCF. So there's a couple of things there. One, I was a very early contributor to Kubernetes when I was at CoreOS. And this is around the time that Red Hat and Google are collaborating very closely on this thing we call Kubernetes. And at this point, there are no foundations. There's just kind of this project that everyone seems to have an opportunity to benefit from. And then we started this event. Patrick Riley and Joseph Jacks started the very first KubeCon. Again, there is no CNCF. And these two people from the community decided that they wanted to have a, community-driven, not vendor-driven conference. And I was brought in very early in terms of being the MC. I guess technically, my name is on one of the founders of that particular conference, but I think Patrick Riley and Joseph Jacks deserve the majority of the credit. So they put up the initial money. We did the first event in San Francisco. And I think when the event was put together, not people weren't really sure, because Kubernetes wasn't really that popular yet, right? People were very interested, but it wasn't super popular, and it wasn't guaranteed to be successful. So once we did a few of the KubeCons, I think the CNCF was kind of formed, number one, for Google to find a home for Kubernetes, to keep it a neutral thing, because now you have Microsoft using, you have Red Hat using, and then of course there's going to be other providers who want to make sure that their contributions and all the licenses, logos, trademarks have a clear definition of how they can be used. And then the conference, of course, since it carried the Kubernetes brand, KubeCon was a name that they came up with. Joseph Jackson, Patrick Riley, it was just kind of natural to try to bring the community along with it. So that's how that happens, right? So, and then where we're at now is that, in the beginning, CNCF, if you think about it, a lot of big open source projects suffer from a major problem. What happens when people are no longer interested in maintaining? right? How do you keep a project sustainable? So just like the Apache Foundation, there's other foundations that we know about. But the CNCF has this kind of collection. I guess Kubernetes was its nucleus, but things like Prometheus, Fluentd, et cetera. Some of these projects are actually pretty big, like Kubernetes, but some of the projects are super small, kind of like Fluentd and some of the other ones that are actually super critical. How do you make sure that they are very sustainable long term? And I think that's what the CNCF is about, ensuring their sustainability. And I guess the last thing here is there's a lot of projects. I think there's probably too many. And some people would say we have to be clear about the distinction between a sandbox project, a proposed project. And I think those things are there to raise awareness, like, hey, community, there's a solution in this area. I think sometimes if you look at, there's overlapping solutions, right? Do you go with Envoy or Linkerd? Some would say Linkerd is more of a service mesh. Envoy is just a component. But you kind of have a lot of these overlapping concerns. And I think that's why we have this idea of there's a project that has graduated. But either way, each of these projects could use a little bit of sustainability, governance, and community.
Yeah, I didn't do that because if you see the CNCF projects also, because there are lots of companies of the different sizes, like there might be the support from the Google or Red Hat or Microsoft. So the big projects are mostly with which have the support from the bigger companies, but we see though they might have the more possibilities and more challenging and more helpful also, but with the support from the smaller companies, backed by the smaller companies, is there any way CNCF could help and could also engage with the more communities for those kinds of projects, those backed by
Yeah.
smaller companies also?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the CNCF does a great job of raising awareness, right? Because a lot of people wouldn't know what most of these projects were without being in the CNCF umbrella. So that's one. I think number two, a lot of times, a lot of these people who start these projects are kind of introduced to some of the bigger companies. Given that they are in the CNCF, then instills a bit of confidence. So if you're Google or Microsoft, you're going to say, hey, maybe I can trust Fluentd because we know what's going on with the license. We've met the founders. We know who's contributing. We can contribute. So I think in that case, you kind of create this ecosystem where if you want a project to be sustainable, you can just contribute. There are some people from some of these projects that do or eventually hired by some of the bigger companies to work full time on their products. I know Google has in the past used some of these CNCF projects in a commercial relationship, right? Where there's a partnership where GKE is shipping one of the components from the CNCF. So there's many ways, but this kind of gets down to open source in general. Most people hear free and they don't want to pay any money for the software. That makes it very hard to be sustainable, even when companies try to build a startup. So I think the community has to understand like, hey, it's going to be more than just having the big providers kind of try to figure everything out. We also have to figure out how do we individually, or even at our companies we work at that level, how do we support these projects without relying on just a handful of big vendors to cover the cost?
Yeah, and also for the companies, they might be creating some open source project, and that might be helpful for the communities in the cloud native or any of the world. So what could be a motivating point for the companies to start engage few of the developers for the special project that could be handed over to community over the time? So what would be the a motivation point for the company itself also by engaging the community projects? What do you think?
Yeah, I think most people have to be very honest here, right? Honest and transparent. There's one belief that we're just all doing this because we're so nice. We love the people. We love the community. Probably not. I think these companies are nice. I think these companies are generous. But think about it. In the open source community, there are so many great projects. I'll use Envoy as an example. Matt Klein and the team over at Lyft, they're not in the business of selling load balancers or proxies, but they built something for themselves. And Matt could have easily started a company or a startup around Envoy, and then maybe there's a different vibe coming from that community, but he didn't. He decided that this should be a truly open project. And for him, his motivation is that he's built some great software any person in the world that builds great software would love to see people use that software. The nice thing about the Envoy relationship is that Google, Microsoft, I believe even maybe Amazon, there's so many companies now that are contributing to Envoy in a meaningful way, that's the right healthy balance, right? Those that are contributing are also benefiting from the software. And I think Matt is fine, right? He's employed by Lyft. He's probably making great money. He's not worried about necessarily growing a big Envoy business. So that's a very healthy relationship. But then there's going to be more contentious relationships, right? Where I have a commercial product. Why would someone buy that commercial product if there's something that is pretty good, maybe 80% is good, but for free in the open source community? Then it's going to be challenging to have a successful business when the core of your product is free, right? Free in the sense of dollars, even though there's going to be someone supporting that software. And I think that's where it gets tricky. So these days, I think any infrastructure company really has to think carefully about, if I want my infrastructure tool to be used at scale, I might have to have an open source component to be competitive, right? So I think for some people, yes, they're doing because they care about community, but it's also a competitive aspect. And then honestly, it's probably going to be a good way to raise awareness about your commercial product, right? So maybe 80% of it is free, maybe a certain feature set is free. That allows you to be competitive at that price point, but then to offer services and additional value on top, as long as the community doesn't come up with something more competitive that makes your value maybe go down a little bit.
Yeah. And also, there are lots of people in here who have started their career from now, and there are like few people who have years of experience. So, in that term, what advice would you give for those who want to contribute to the open source communities? Could like the collaboration be done? And for the starting point, it might be harder. Like we might jump directly into like how can I contribute to Kubernetes and all of those things. But what would be a starting point, and maybe you can relate this with your own journey also from the starting of the collaboration to open source software?
Yeah, it's a good question. Before I answer, I think there was a question that jumped into chat, so I'm just going to pull it and answer it really quickly. So the question inside of the chat was, what's the process for an open source project to join the CNCF? And what does work for the project? And does it work for project with the enterprise version? So this is a really good question, and it kind of touches on the question you just asked. But the process, honestly, there's a process to kind of get an incubation, right? Just to say, hey, here's my product, here's what it does. And you can present it to the foundation, and there's going to be a set of people who review. Of course, you want to have a process that's fair and equitable to all the teams and projects that are working on things. And the goal would be, it's like, hey, maybe you go through incubation. Maybe there's a sandbox place where you can start to bootstrap, use some of the tools that are working for the big projects. Like, they don't force you to have a logo. They're not going to force you to have a certain governance model, but they are going to share tips and tricks on how to actually build a sustainable community if that's what you're looking for. They're going to give you tips and tricks on how to have a governance model that works with even competitors that want to contribute. So in that case, it's going to be this process of, I think they'll, a lot of projects will be able to come in under that sandbox or incubation, but then you're going to have a lot more criteria to exit those stages and be considered to be a graduated project. So I don't think every project will graduate, but I think it's a good exercise that if you're a small team and you want to have a little bit more framework for building a successful, sustainable project, then it might be interesting to you. So I'm going to switch over to, and then the thing about enterprise versions, you got to be real tricky. I mean, this is a really tricky area, because if the community wants to add something that you say should be proprietary or enterprise only, that's going to cause a conflict within your own community, right? Your community is going to say, hey, we've done the work, we've wrote the code, we want you to review and merge this code or functionality that competes with the business model. And thing is, how do you pay the software developers that are working on the open source project? Everything can't be $0. So this is where I think there's going to be some tension, and it's healthy tension. So this is where I think if you're a commercial product that has an open source component or open source version, I think you have to be very transparent with your community and say, hey, look, this is how we make money. We believe that this part should not be inside of the open source part in order for us to be able to make money. And that's how this is going to be sustainable. So I think that's going to be the key, is just being transparent. I think HashiCorp does a good job, right? They have an enterprise version of many of their popular open source projects. The same is true for like CockroachDB and so forth. So I think that's kind of the main thing. Maybe there's another one here. CNCF does not only cater to open source. How does proprietary things get evaluated inside the incubator? Doesn't this conflict with the mission? I think in order for any contributions or collaboration to occur, it's going to be really hard to do it if no one can see the source code. If no one can see the source code and all you're giving is binaries, that's going to be a bit too tricky, I think, to be a sustainable project, because if there is no plan in place to say you need to modify this software for vulnerabilities or security, I think that puts too much pressure on the contributing company to like do all of the work for everyone. So I don't know if it's a good place for like proprietary software. And I don't think it just passed the test around open and collaboration. That's, I think, is required if you want to be in the foundation. So I just think that in those cases, you can sponsor a project, you can sponsor an event to raise awareness about your proprietary software. And I think people will welcome that. We also have a lot of people who are proprietary vendors in nature, but they still contribute to open source software, at least the components, because they ship it in their bigger offering. And that's a good balance for a lot of companies. Everything doesn't need to be open source. And I think CNCF will definitely welcome contributions from anywhere. All right, so now I'm going to go back to your question that you started with earlier, which is, how does someone new get into this? And I think this is where you have to think about what you want out of it. There's going to be different cases. Sometimes you just really want to get famous. It's a funny thing to think about, but yeah, some people say, you know what, if I just become a contributor to this big project, everyone will know my name and I'll be famous. And if I'm famous, then I'll get a really great job, or I can start my own company based on that credibility that I've earned. And that's one way to look at it, but it's very hard to be sustainable, because if you don't care about these projects that you're contributing to, maybe you don't even use them, but you just want to work on them because it seems to be super popular. That's going to be very hard to be sustainable, because you don't really have a motivation when there's a bug in the area that you've contributed to come back and fix it, because you're like, nope, I've done my contribution. I am done with this. I don't want to maintain it anymore. And I don't know if that's ever happened to a feature inside of Kubernetes, but there's been plenty of projects where when features are added in that way, they may have to get removed because no one cares about it. No one wants to maintain it going forward. So then it has to be removed from the code base because no one's truly maintaining that piece. So I think when you start to think about what are your personal motivations, my personal motivations have been, I like to contribute to tools that I'm using. So the first set of my open source contributions were very early in my career. I would probably say within the first 5 years of my career. I was using Python quite a bit. And I was using tools like disutils, which is like the package manager for Python. And my early contributions to Python core were to disutils and pip. And in those areas, because I was using those, I wanted them to be better. There were some features that I personally wanted to see land. So I decided to contribute because I was using. And it was very sustainable, because when I would go to work, we were using these tools. And then when I would go home, I would contribute to those tools. And I also built a lot of credibility in the Python community. And it seems like every company that I switch to, I tend to try to contribute to the tools we're using, whether that's Terraform, Ansible, Puppet. And Puppet was one of those tools where I did a lot of contributions, and it did lead to a great outcome, because I ended up getting a job at Puppet Labs where I can continue to work on Puppet full time. And the last thing I'll say here is sometimes it's not about contributing to your to a big project. Sometimes it's about creating a project as well. So CompD was one of the projects that I created, which was when I left Puppet, I figured in the container world, we don't need a full-blown configuration management. We just need a little bit of configuration tools. That's where I decided to create CompD, because we were using it at my own company, and I built it for that purpose, and I decided to open source it, and then it became a bit popular. And I think there was a case where it also inspired other tools like Console Template from HashiCorp. So sometimes one of the best contributions you can do is just sharing some of the tools and solutions that you make for yourself, even if they're very small, because someone else probably has a similar problem.
So yeah, so maybe that could be creating a simple PR or issues in the GitHub, yeah, That could be a good starting point. So heading over to the questions, so we had asked to put the questions in Slido today morning. So there is one interesting question, and I just want to add it while we are connected with the same question. So, what is your advice to 21 years old Kelsey or someone who is fresh graduates out of college, just started their career in software development?
Yeah, so I didn't go to college. So I would probably say college is not a requirement. You know, you don't have to go to college to, I think, to be successful. Some careers do require, because, you know, if you want to be a lawyer in the United States or a doctor, there's certain things you have to do, and college might be the only way to do those things. But for a software engineer, what I would say to a 21-year-old is that your career is going to be as long as you are fortunate to have it, but you have to focus on acquiring skills as you go. So coming out of college and just wanting to be a senior engineer, or over optimizing for what you think these roles are, I don't know if that's the best approach. I think the best approach is, when you're young, you want to start building your foundation that you'll use later in your career. For example, I would rather go to a company where there's a smaller team, maybe a smaller company, where I will get more opportunities to work on maybe some front end, maybe work on some back end. And you don't need to necessarily pick your favorite language quite yet, right? Some people say, oh, I am a Go developer, I am a Linux administrator. There's no real need to really just identify with just one or two tools. Your job really is to say, hey, what is this technology and what are the fundamentals? I think when you first enter the industry, you're going to look at all the open roles. They're going to say they need 5 years of Linux. They want PHP. They want this. They want that. And it's okay. You're going to learn those tools. But what you should do then is say, hey, how do these tools work at a fundamental level? So imagine someone that's 21 years old now, and they look at all this Kubernetes, Prometheus, and they're going to try to spend a bunch of time learning the tools. They're going to go get Kubernetes certification. They're going to get some cloud certification. And that's okay. That's a good way to start. But once you learn Kubernetes, one thing you can do is figure out, how do distributed systems work? Why is Kubernetes a distributed system? Why is it using etcd? How is the kernel providing isolation? Those are fundamentals that, even if Kubernetes were to go away and something else were to come replace it, a lot of those concepts will persist and apply to other areas. So I think if you're 21 years old, learn the tools, but don't miss out on learning the fundamentals. That is the really, really important part, and it will accelerate your growth.
Yeah, that's a good insight. So that's the one question from Milan. So because you have lots of interesting, so you're mostly like focused on giving the live demo. So adding to that, how much time and effort you invest on keynote, slide, and those kick-ass presentations?
Yeah, so let's give you one. So let's talk about one, the path to serverless. There was one that I did in KubeCon. I don't know, it was maybe 2018 KubeCon, but it was titled Path to Serverless. And so a couple of things. I tend not to use any slides, just for my style. Some people are great at it. They write beautiful slides. They know how to use them properly. I don't. So I think in that KubeCon talk it's called The Path to Serverless, I was inspired by the Hidden Figures movie. So there's 4 women engineers, they're Black women, who really played an instrumental role in NASA helping the US get to, to space and bringing people back again. So I set up the slides with just 4 images of those ladies, and that's it, right? I don't need a lot of slides. I don't need to do a bunch of diagrams, because I'm telling a story. And so I typically don't write the talk. I'm not saying everyone should do it this way, but I typically don't write it down. I don't have any speaker notes. I just kind of, in my mind, know what story I want to tell. So for that particular story, I was really interested in Lambda. Lambda had just released, custom runtimes. So now you can actually say any language you want to use in Lambda, you can actually build your own runtime binary and ship it. And I looked at that and said, hey, this is very close to what Docker is doing. Even though the API is different, even though maybe the type of app and the style that you write it in is different, but it's starting to open up and allow more workloads. And I looked at Kubernetes, and Kubernetes is so complex. We have all of these moving pieces. It's like very low level for what a lot of people are trying to do. And I felt at that time, now that Kubernetes was about 5 or 6 years old at the time, like, how do we move forward? And then we have to change the thinking that just installing Kubernetes and writing a bunch of YAML is not the best way forward for the community. I figured that Lambda was a good example that we could aspire to. So I knew the premise was going to be, how do we go from Kubernetes to Lambda? So those are my anchor pieces. So now I have to write a bunch of code, because in order for me to really understand what I'm talking about, I need to write the code. So I look at the documentation for Lambda. Here's the things you have to do for a custom runtime. And then you start to get a little creative. What if I was able to build a tool that can actually take a container from Kubernetes and move it to Lambda? And that's a big idea. So then you say, well, what kind of app can run in both places at the same time? So then I write a bit of code and say, okay, I'm going to make it work for Kubernetes first. And then I'm going to build a shim that detects when I'm inside of Lambda. And then I will change how I bootstrap. So that way the same binary with no code changes can run on Kubernetes and on Lambda. So now that I have a single executable to demonstrate the premise, now I can start to step back and start to do things like, I think I built a tool called Diana, which plays music whenever I run the code. It goes to Kubernetes live, pulls down the config, extracts the binary from the container, wraps it into Lambda, and then pushes it. So that was added the night before, right? So now I'm thinking about the high-level presentation. I have a good story. I'm going to use Fortran just to make it a little bit more interesting to match the time period from the movie. So I said, let me just use Fortran to let people see something new, to really show off the power of custom runtimes for Lambda. And it's giving people some new information, maybe making it fun, maybe making it entertaining, making it a little bit interesting, but also forcing people to think a little bit. And sometimes tools like Diana, which moves from Kubernetes to Lambda, I wrote the night before, and I added the music component the night before, right? So I probably spend about 20, 30 hours on the code, making the code clean, simple, making sure the code works. But after I have the code, after I have the story in my mind, then I go on stage and I hope for the best, because I don't know what order I'm going to say things.
Yeah, because like in the mass, because there are lots of different levels of people who are just a beginner or maybe haven't thought about that, and maybe somebody might have worked completely and had a good experience in that. So maybe do you start with the firstly with the like the basic things and come up with the, I see like in your lots of demo you don't specify too many complex things, even like too many complexities for the experienced people, but still they are interesting for those. So and adding to those for the beginner where we just want to share and we're hesitant to come to the stage or to just speak around. So like in your early days also you might have some kind of experience, you might have some like horror experience being in the stage at the first site. So like any suggestion for the starters?
Yeah, I think a lot of times you believe you have to go up there and be an expert, or you have to be the smartest person ever to give a talk on a topic. The goal is to make a hard thing look easy. So the first thing to do is, can you do it for yourself? So let's say you're learning anything. It doesn't matter what you're learning. You don't have to do it for other people. You can do it for yourself first. So a lot of times if I'm learning something and I get happy, I'm saying, hey, I really like this experience. I saw a new thing. I'm learning myself, or maybe I saw an old thing that I finally understand. And then whatever helped me finally understand it, that's going to be my presentation, right? I don't care about, oh, let me show people this complex thing, because when I learn complex things, I actually do that differently. I need to really spend time with it. I need a lot more code. I need a lot more diagrams. And then it's so niche that it's not a good story. It's hard to build around it. So one concept that I come with is just learning in public. There's been some keynotes that I've given, especially at like HashiConf, where they'll release a new product. Like when they came out with Nomad, I remember the night before, I changed my talk from being a Kubernetes talk to being a Kubernetes versus Nomad talk. And that allowed me to explore this new tool that everyone is excited about, including myself. But I was okay just saying in the beginning, hey, I don't know how Nomad works, but I'm going to talk about it from the beginner's point of view. So I think it's just okay to be yourself, because a lot of people are going to be in the same situation that you're in, and they're going to appreciate. Sometimes I do some advanced things when I talk at like a Go meetup, and then sometimes I do things that are beginner, because guess what? I'm always a beginner in something, and sometimes I'm an expert in something. But for keynotes, it tends to work for the big audience because there's going to be very few times where 30,000 people are all experts, right? Majority is going to be less than 5% will be experts.
Yeah, I don't do that. I think I saw your presentation on the .NET Conf, and was it was like surprise seeing you at the .NET conference, and you just make it so simple with the new language also, how to build the Docker and getting it deployed. So yeah, that was interesting. So let me roll Tara for adding more questions, and I will be going in the background for moderating few of those live questions. So Tara.
Yeah, thank you, Raju. Hello, Kelsey. Nice to have
Hey,
you here. Yeah, good.
awesome.
Yeah, I'm the one of the co-organizers or of the events, so I'll also help to facilitate the questions and all. So the next questions I have is related to like when can a company realize that they need to go to the Kubernetes, right? So they might be in dilemma whether if it's a right choice or not, or how can they make that decision?
So for example, if I was going to the cloud from scratch, like I have a new app and I'm going to go to cloud for the first time, I might try to do serverless first. Like if I'm in GCP, I'm probably going to try Cloud Run. I like containers. I know if I use a container, I can use it with Kubernetes. I can use it with Azure, ACI. I can do it with so many things. So maybe I would just start with serverless and containers. Now, once you start doing things like I'm going to do batch job, cron job, web app, and once you start to have like a very big diversity of workloads, and then you're going to start to say, hey, I have to make a decision now. I can go and set up Terraform, use a lot of VMs, group the VMs based on how they're being used, whether they're being used for batch jobs, machine learning, etc. And then I'm going to do some configuration management on top. Maybe I'm going to use Puff, Shepherd, Ansible. And then you start doing things like auto scaling and load balancing, and you're putting all of this into Terraform. At that point, you start to say, wow, I am using a lot of tools to do what Kubernetes is effectively doing. Because for most people that are very successful with Kubernetes, they have experience with config management, Terraform, and building their own tools to do scaling, etc., service discovery. They have so much tools. So then when you look at Kubernetes from that standpoint, things tend to get simpler. You get less tools. There's one kind of way of thinking about and doing things. You kind of get a bit of configuration management, but you get configuration management in the world of Kubernetes by writing these YAML files on top of high-level abstractions. Whereas when you're working with VMs, you're often building those abstractions, right? Even if you're using containers with VMs, you still have to figure out where the files go, how to update those files, how to secure all the various components. And that seems to be too many moving pieces. So to me, for most companies, you realize that maybe Kubernetes is a better fit. Just like when you're writing code, right? You can write code from scratch. And sometimes you're going to figure out, you know what, I just need a library. What I'm doing is no longer that simple. Let me just go find a library that someone else has written or part of my standard library and use that instead. So you got to just figure out where you are. If you're a small company and you're only just doing a few web services, even if you're getting a lot of traffic, for those companies, they may just be better off using something like Cloud Run and Cloud SQL and then just be done with it. So I would say not everyone needs Kubernetes, but if you want to be able to use Kubernetes in the future, maybe just starting with containers will always give you the option to use Kubernetes later on, so you don't have to worry about missing out.
Yeah, great. So suppose if someone shifts to the Kubernetes, and so any what are the things that might go wrong or horribles? Any stories you want to share?
So you're saying when things go wrong with Kubernetes, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so a lot of the things that I've seen go wrong is people don't understand it's a distributed system. And sometimes you're going to make things go worse. Because if you don't understand that Kubernetes is going to require your application to be a bit decoupled from the machine if you want to get the most value from it. So some examples you'll see is like some people have an app that runs really great on a VM. Let's say it's written in Java. And this app can use all of the CPUs, all of the memory. So they have 16 CPUs, they have 32 gigs of RAM, and the app is running fine. They've tuned the JVM for the machine. And then they say, oh, Kubernetes is the new thing. let me just take the app and put it in a container and just run it in Kubernetes. And then what they'll find is that in the Kubernetes world, some of the defaults around CPU limits, CPU requests, they don't understand how all of those things work. So then the app starts to behave really differently, but only differently at specific times. Maybe when there's lots of load, but not otherwise. Or when they start having multiple apps on a single machine. Since they don't understand how Kubernetes works, they could just have a very long outage where this app is running on a machine and these two apps now are competing and having a lot of CPU contention, but they don't understand that the CPU limit is really the problem, because normally on a VM, we don't set CPU limits, right? We just let the kernel figure out how to share the CPU, and somehow things just keep working. But in Kubernetes, some people will read some docs, read a blog post and say, oh, let me just set the CPU limit. And now that they set the CPU limit, even though there's extra CPU and the kernel could handle it, now Kubernetes is stepping in with its configuration, having the kernel do something else, and now it just looks like chaos. Everything is moving around, the app is running slow, but the CPU utilization is low, and you're not sure why. And then the customer's just really confused. They don't know if it's Kubernetes that is broken, is it their app that's broken? And that's a horror story that I think a lot of companies go through early on, because you really need to understand how resources work in Kubernetes, because it's not just simple as package your app and let Kubernetes do the rest. You really do need to understand how those settings interact with the CPU. The last thing I would say is Kubernetes upgrades leads to a lot of horror stories. People are using third-party extensions, maybe using something like Certificate Manager, or maybe you're using like some network security policy tool. And that tool works against Kubernetes 1.14. And then 1.16 comes out, but you're using the old version of the tool. And as soon as you upgrade to Kubernetes 1.16, the network policy thing doesn't work, or the third-party thing that you're using doesn't work. And then what happens is now everything is down. And the reason why it's not working is because it doesn't understand that some of the fields were deprecated, or they moved from beta to some other thing, or maybe the name got changed between beta and GA. So the name is wrong. Either way, the API call isn't working. And when that happens, again, people are very confused. It was working in 1.14, now it's not working in 1.16, and good luck trying to troubleshoot that. And that feels like a nightmare.
Yeah, great. Okay, I have one question that we often get asked, like it's regarding the certification exams. Like, is it what's your take on this? Like, should someone go for this, or is it good for the someone who is already working, or is it good for the beginners, or what's your thought on this?
Yeah, when I started my IT career, I started with certificates because I didn't know what I didn't know, right? So I was learning kind of Unix on my own time. I was learning, shell scripting on my own time, but I didn't know how to articulate that. So for me, I said, hey, let me just go get a couple of exams. So back then I was getting things like the A+ exam, which is like proving your knowledge for basics of hardware, GPU, CPU, memory, motherboard, etc. And then I also did Network Plus to demonstrate my understanding of IP addresses and subnets and those things. So I think when you're early on, it's really hard to engage confidence of your skills. So I think for most people, when you go get the certification, it may help you just psychologically, right? Just to say, hey, I've proven that I know a thing, and that might be boostful for your career. And some employers that also, especially when the technology is new, they may have no idea how to decide whether someone knows what they're talking about or not. And if a certification can help them at least talk about things with the same language, this is what a service is, this is what a pod is, I think it's good for most people. If you have the time and maybe even the money, it's not a bad thing to say, I got the certification. I remember getting my Red Hat certification, which I still think is a really great certification, Red Hat Certified Engineer. And this is when I used to work in web hosting. So I was already working in the industry for a number of years before I decided to go get the Red Hat certification. Because the Red Hat certification, if those that don't know, it's very hands-on. You go there, there's a real computer, they break it, and you have to do things like repair RAID or repair this, and then install mail server, configure it correctly, and then see if it actually works. I had been doing that for my job. So the Red Hat Certified Engineer exam, I think they give you like, let's say it's 2 or 3 hours to do it. I remember getting it done in like 15 minutes because it was something I was doing every day. So to me, it kind of proved to me that, oh, I do have the skills to make this test real easy. So that's the thing I like about the Kubernetes exam. It gives people confidence. And if you do really good at it, you may decide like, oh, I don't know if I needed it now, but at least I know where I stand.
Yeah, great. Okay, and I have one last questions. Like, there are so many title in the market, like DevOps, SRE, DevOps 6. Like, what exactly is it? Like, what's your thought on this?
Yeah, so this is one area where I think people just take these titles without understanding what they mean, right? Because of fashion, right? Like some people say, you know, like being rich has a criteria. You probably need to have more money relative to other people. So you just can't walk around and say, I'm rich, but it turns out you can. Who's going to tell you otherwise? And when I look at things like SRE and DevOps, you have to understand sometimes where those words originate. For example, when people say SRE, a lot of people say that originates from Google, Site Reliability Engineer. But then when you think about what actually occurs in that job, these are engineers that could work on Gmail, they could work on a database, they can work on networking, but they choose to focus on reliability. And what that means is they may not necessarily be your traditional system administrator. They may not be your traditional someone that just writes bash scripts and deploys it on the server. They may have a slightly different skill set. So the SRE that I think some people are talking about are, you know, these are software engineers that take a software engineer mindset. They write a lot of code, they can build application code, but they've chosen to focus. And then there are some people who don't understand that component. So they just say, oh, I'm doing DevOps. Maybe now I'm doing SRE. Maybe that works, right? You can actually be doing the same workflows and some of the principles from SRE. But often, more often than it should, speaking from personal experience, most people are using the DevOps as an aspirational title. It's used to describe what you want your people to be doing, right? So if you think about it, before DevOps, people were finding a way to get stuff done. Not every company is successful, but the reason why they were not successful wasn't because they didn't know DevOps. It's because of their behavior was not going to help that company be successful. So some people say, then what behavior should I be doing? Now, as a human being, there are just some very common behaviors that lead to success, like collaborating with people, working with people, communicating with people, understanding what people are trying to do. These are basic human things for every industry, every situation, for your family, for your school, for your work. No matter what your work is, these are fundamental things that humans need to do to be successful. Now, the DevOps movement takes a few of those human things and applies them to technology. So some people say, oh, we should collaborate. That's doing DevOps. Okay, if that's what that means to you, the fundamental gap there, though, is I don't think a lot of these people understand what it means to be collaborative, to be working this way. So DevOps for them is an aspiration that they want to do these things. But if they can't do these things without understanding that DevOps is not a requirement, then I don't know if they're going to ever be successful, right? So just saying this is my DevOps team doesn't mean very much. I need to see the behavior and I need to see the outcomes. And there are teams that have both of those without using the word DevOps, and they're going to be just fine.
Yeah, great. So thanks for your answers. Now I would like to hand over to Milan. Please take over and please facilitate.
Thank you, Tara. Am I audible?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I don't like I'm so nervous at the same time, like I'm so excited to have you to talk to you in person. It's a great honor for me and such a wonderful people for assisting. So yeah, my question is let me pull the question from the crowd. I'll start from my one personal question. So yeah, you have been talking about like the personal brand of yourself, right? So yeah, I'm in the like path where like I'm in conflict, like should I work for a company or should I improve myself in the area I love to work? So how and when do we identify with our personal brand? And what's your advice on this?
Yeah, I think once you're born and given a name, that's the establishment of your personal brand. A lot of times where we're born, the country that we're born in, the name that we're given, those all kind of contribute to our identity in some ways. You can change either of those things, but those things that you carry are part of your personal brand. So when you interact with a person in your neighborhood, when you interact with someone in your family, they start to understand who you are and who you represent. And then you're going to be known for something. Either this guy's a nice guy or this person's a mean person. Whatever those things are, these are the things that you project out into the world. And in the marketing terms, of course, we can say this is your personal brand. So when you think about personal brand, for some people, it's going to be this ability to separate maybe who you really are as a person from your professional career, right? There's some people who do like music, for example, who they are on stage is not who they are in real life. So sometimes they will then say, my personal brand for my music, I will take this identity. But then for my other things, I will have a different identity. So sometimes for people like me, my personal brand is very close to my work identity. The things that I believe in. I'm a minimalist. I like people in general. So not just people in tech, but people in general. I think about how best to assist people in the world, whether it's writing code or is it just helping them move to a new house or something. So when it comes to personal brand, you have to ask yourself, how do you want to be perceived? Now, if you want two different identities, that means you're going to have to be a different person sometimes. And that's really hard to be sustainable. So for me, if you're going to be a personal brand, I like the idea of like making the two be very close to being the same so it can be very sustainable. So my advice here would be, what do you want to be known for? So you talked about getting a job. Well, a job is not going to, it can help your personal brand. Maybe for me, I like Go, I like Kubernetes before joining Google. But then joining Google where those things are created, those things are made, it's easy to be one and the same. If I were to go take a job at an unrelated field, then that job may not contribute a lot to the things I do in the outside world. So if you can get lucky where you have a job that contributes to your personal brand, then great. But you also got to think beyond the technology, right? At most companies, there's always this challenge to grow in terms of how you collaborate and work with people. And I think that should be part of everyone's personal brand. So it's not about just having, like, for example, my personal brand is not Kubernetes. Kubernetes is just what people is hot today. And if you asked me 7 years ago, it would have been Puppet. And before that, it would have been Python. And in the middle, there would have been Ruby. There would have been Golang. So to me, it's just, I'm kind of the constant. Kelsey Hightower is the thing that I'm projecting to the world. All the other technologies are the tools in my toolbox. So I would say, no matter what company you work at, always learn a skill set that can probably contribute to your personal brand. There's no need to try to represent the company as part of your personal brand.
Yeah, Kelsey, that's a very like insightful way of thinking about it. Like, yeah, I'm struggling. Like sometimes I work for a company, and sometimes I just like move out of the company and work as a contractor. I've been working as a system admin with the DevOps role. They call it DevOps. But yeah, I like to identify myself as a complete developer who look around the problem and try to solve it in the best way possible with the best tool at the disposal. So yeah, I think you covered my answers. So thanks on that. Moving next, like I'd like to take the question from the crowd. So yeah, this is about the no code. So yeah, can you explain like what's your thought process? Is it a sarcasm or yeah?
Yeah, so the no code repository, the story there, I was in Google office in California, which is about a 2-hour flight from where I live. And we were just doing some work and we're doing some work with customers. And I was seeing some things online where people were building more and more new projects. And I'm looking at these new projects and saying, there's already 5 projects just like that one. There's nothing wrong with like building a new project because we should, because if we didn't, we would not have Kubernetes and we would not have Golang. But I also felt that sometimes we're writing just way too much code to solve problems, right? Where people see a problem or they hear a problem, and before even understanding the problem or researching, has the problem already been solved? most people just start writing code. So I decided to write this just no code thing. I was going to just tweet something no code, but I decided let's just go really, really far. Let's just make a GitHub repository and make an entire tutorial framework, everything. And I thought honestly that most people look at it and just say, okay, this is Kelsey's just being silly right now. And I just posted a link because that README had everything I really wanted to say. But I wanted the bit of sarcasm to show people that most of the work that we're doing, this is what we're doing. We're overdoing it sometimes. But the real essence there was a great engineer is going to understand when nothing needs to be built. That is the pinnacle of, to me, of great engineering. It's not always about being an inventor or designing things from scratch. It's about when knowing not to write any code. So to me, no code should be this idea that, do you really need to write code to solve this problem? And sometimes the best solutions we've ever seen are ones that can take existing things and then just glue them together and make something nice from that, right? It's just like cooking, right? You go buy the ingredients, and it's the way that you put them together is when you come up with a new dish. So I think most people should think about, hey, do I really need to write code? Because code is a liability. It's not something that always makes things better.
Yeah, that's a good one. Like, that's a way of putting it. Like, yeah, I'd like to have a t-shirt printed with no code, github.com/Kelsey/no code.
Maybe I'll make one. I'm going to take one question really quick from the Google chat. This one was about what things I find difficult in the tech world and how would I like to change it. So one thing I find difficult is this concept of easy. Everybody wants easy. Everyone says, oh, I need easy. The problem with easy, that is, if I make it easy, then I'm probably going to make it very difficult later. So easy is this big trade-off, right? Because the reason why we want some things to be complex is because we don't know how we want to use them. So therefore, they can't necessarily be easy. They're going to be hard to learn, but then maybe they're easy to use. So I think one thing that I think I find difficult is that all technology, anything that you actually understand, I think one piece of technology, if we were to consider language a technology, every language you don't know is very hard and complex. All of the words, all of the alphabets, all of the books, all of the sentences, you don't understand anything about them. So for you, it's like an extremely difficult thing that there's no way you find it approachable. But the language you do know, for some reason, you can use it easily. You can communicate things to other people. But most technology is like that. When you really learn networking, then most of it looks very familiar and it's usually easy to pick up. Same is true for programming. So I think it's this concept of this desire for easy. It's the people piece that I find very hard, is that people want something to be powerful and easy at the same time. And sometimes that can happen, right? Like if you buy an iPhone, it's fairly easy to use. It has very limited ways that you can change it, but that's what makes it easy. But if you want it to be more advanced, then we have to expose more of the interface. So advanced would be people who are writing iPhone apps. Their world is complex, and they present a very limited interface so that the user can have something that's relatively easy. But iOS itself, the entire iPhone, depending on how low you want to go, is not easy. But at the very top of those levels, it can be easy. So we have to understand that balance.
Yeah, thank you, Kelsey. So yeah, moving on next. Next, we are already like 1 hour. I didn't realize that. So I think we should pass the session. I mean, open mic. We usually do this in our session. So be ready with the questions. Audience, you could like unmute. We could take 2 or 3 questions. So yeah, I'd like to take this one final question. Like, what's your
So
suggestion?
just for everyone, I have more time, so I'm happy to spend another 15, 20 minutes. If people really want to stay on with me for more time, I'm happy to stick around if people want to do that. So if that's something you want to have happen, I'll stick around as long as you know, for a little bit more.
That would be great. Yeah.
So, okay, yeah, let's move on to the next question. What do you suggest like on balancing your life and work and working remotely in this new time?
So one thing I've tried to do was, in many ways, be what they call like the whole person. So internally, when I'm in a meeting, I really like to help people. I like to get to know them, and I like to share in their challenges and their success. So when you think about balancing work life, I try to make sure that I get off of work on time. So one thing I like to do is I like to start working before everyone else. I've been working remotely for CoreOS, for Puppet, for Google now. So the last 10, 12 years of my career, I've always worked remotely. But I do spend time with humans, with the team in person as much as I can to balance those things out. So I think about working remotely, you have to have some serious discipline. You never want a situation where people are not sure what you're doing. If people are not sure what you're doing, you're probably going to be in trouble working remotely. At least when you're in the office, people just say, okay, I can see you. You're probably doing something, even if I'm not sure what it is. But when you're remotely, people may not be able to see you. So it's going to be very confusing. So for me, when I'm working remotely, I like to have my calendar reflect what I'm working. So even if I get an ad hoc meeting, someone wants to do a quick Google Hangout or something, I'll put it on my calendar and say, hey, let me send you an invite so it's on my calendar, and I'll put the topic there. So it's very clear from my calendar what I'm doing and how much time I actually have. And then also at the end of my day, or even throughout my day, I actually have blocks that say learning. I want to learn more about the Spiffy protocol because I want to know how Istio is using it. I want to learn more about this particular technology. So I'll set aside maybe 2 hours to make sure that I'm also learning and not just working. So I think working remotely, I try to communicate what I'm working on to the people who need to know in a very easy to digest format. So no one's ever confused, is Kelsey actually getting any work done? And I'm very disciplined about what areas I'm focused on. So that's number one. And I also know when to turn it off. So around, towards the end of the day, if I'm going to continue working, it needs to be on learning and growth and not necessarily trying to do work tasks, right? So I want to get better as a person. I may be studying things like Buddhism to say, hey, I like the way people think about meditation. I want to learn more. I'm a minimalist. How are other people practicing minimalism? So I try to learn other things outside of just software and technology to be a well-balanced person. So how do I incorporate those things back into my life? Well, I'm a minimalist. So I like to practice minimalism in the code that I write. Is the code as simple as it can be? Does it have extra things that don't need to be there? And I try to take the things that I'm learning from real life and bring them back into my work. And that gives me this nice balance of I learn through my work and I'm also learning through life, but I can benefit both of those things by practicing, on either side of that. So that's how I try to find balance to keep myself sane.
Yeah, thank you on that, Kelsey. Like it's very hard. Like we are all trying to work remotely because of this new situation we have. We are trying to adapt it, and yeah, those lessons are usually very helpful because yeah, communicating with the team is particularly very challenging at this time, because when you are in the office, you can just solve the tab and ask for the question or the context, right? So it's kind of hard to pass the context. Yeah, we are learning. So yeah.
I'm going to take another question from the chat really quickly. This is a good one. How runtime security matters in Kubernetes and how observability helps to achieve this. We have lots of kernel features like seccomp, cgroups, namespaces, AppArmor, BPPF, how these things fit together in Kubernetes. So I think the thing about Kubernetes to me, honestly, is like a very thin layer, if you think about it, on top of existing infrastructure concepts, right? Nodes are just VMs, containers are just kernel features aggregated together. So a lot of these technologies you talked about, maybe with the exceptions of BPPF, are really just ways of isolation on a shared kernel. And I think the thing that made it easy for me to understand the most quickly, when you have a shared kernel, you have one major attack vector, which is any kernel bugs. So if I have a kernel bug, they may render C groups, seccomps, namespaces, all of these things useless. Because of one bug, I might be able to exploit all of these other things. And that's where most people have to ask themselves about how much isolation and what attack vector are you worried about? If you're really concerned, you may decide that, look, I cannot share the kernel. So when you don't share the kernel, then I will have to bring in something like either a different virtual machine, maybe something like gvisor, which implements a lot of the kernel features in user space, or maybe even a whole nother bare metal machine on a different network to get a lot of isolation. And you can actually manage isolation at the various levels in Kubernetes through one cluster, right? You can actually have a machine that sits on a whole nother rack and have a bunch of VMs that are all part of the same cluster. Some are sharing the kernel, some apps are not sharing the kernel. So in the Kubernetes world, Kubernetes is more about you figure out the best isolation and security that you want in terms of runtime security, and you configure Kubernetes to enforce it. So you're going to have a thing like anti-affinity. This app can be the only app running on this machine, and I want to use deep isolation at all the levels. So Kubernetes is just more of a configuration to say, okay, in this case, you want to be the only app running on this server and nothing else. I can enforce that through no taints and tolerations, anti-affinity policies, etc. And then on the machines that you are sharing the kernel, then like you've mentioned, you have lots of these features you can use to try to give yourself better isolation. And for a lot of people, that will be pretty good. But for some people, they will just never be comfortable with kernel level isolation because of the attack vector. And that's really the decision you have to make.
Yeah, thank you, Yadav, for the question. So moving on next, like, what would be the good time to adopt cloud-based service for the startup? Is it preferable to use it from the beginning or something else?
So technology always changes. I don't know if there's going to ever be a good time. You're going to have to make this decision slightly differently. So number one, I think the fact that we call it cloud is so confusing, right? Because when people say cloud, they think that we're talking about some different type of compute, and we're not really. If you're let's say you're a startup, okay? You're probably not going to build a data center that's your own, right? You're not going to go and buy some land and build a building. So you're never going to probably be in the data center business yourself anyway. So then what are your options? So let's leave the word cloud out of it. Your next option is, since you're not going to build your own data center, because that would probably take all the money you raised as a startup. So that would be pretty crazy. You're not building a data center startup, you're building something else. So then you ask yourself, what services do I need to use to be a startup? Well, you need a place for people to work. So maybe you rent some space, some office space for the team to come and work. Maybe you buy a few laptops. You're not going to build a laptop from scratch. You're not going to build a building from scratch. You're going to just use some services that other people have built. So the next thing is, if you want maybe just one machine, right? Maybe you're just starting out. Okay, maybe you just buy one machine and put it in a co-location facility. That is very similar to cloud, right? I don't own the building. I'm leasing some server from somewhere and I put it in there. Now, the unfortunate thing though is if you go with a co-location, maybe the price might be cheaper. How cheap? Not sure, but you're gonna have to do a lot of work. You're gonna have to rack it and get your internet connection set up. And some colos will do some of these services. So it's gonna be more about, the question really is, how much managed services should I go for? For example, when you get internet access, that's a managed service. No one wants to be doing internet for themselves, right? That's pretty crazy. So you get a managed service for that. So when it comes to running your app, in 2020, there are so many providers that can take your app, whether it's in a container or some binary, and run it for you. And most startups can build a whole business by just having someone else run their app for them. And you don't have to worry about locking as much because there's so many providers, whether you call them cloud providers or not, that can just run your application, just like internet service providers, right? You pick the one that's closest to you. If the internet goes down or they're not doing a good job, you change your internet service provider. I think that's just where we are in terms of public cloud. So I think as a startup, I would be very careful to make sure that I'm using products and services that have an open interface. For example, I'm okay with using a managed Postgres because it has an open interface. I can run Postgres locally on my laptop doing development. And there's lots of providers who provide a Postgres service. So I do like those kind of products. So even when there's a proprietary or fully managed solution, I think a startup may say, hey, we're not quite sure if this is exactly what we want to do. So let's maybe go for open interface, even though it's fully managed. I'm going to answer this next question on the
You
screen.
answered part of it also, like.
Yeah, can we be cloud native without landing
Yeah.
on public cloud? So this one's pretty crazy, right? It's because when we say cloud native, I think now the whole cloud native thing is being diluted. At this point, when I hear people say cloud native, they're just saying anything that has API, anything that has automation. So 10 years ago, you bought my storage system, which ran on-prem. Hey, we put an API and now we have Kubernetes integration. Boom, cloud native. You're like, what are you talking about? this is the same thing you have last time. How is it now cloud native? It was like, well, we're going to charge you more because we put API and we have Kubernetes integration. So I think this whole cloud native thing has lost a lot of its meaning because everybody's just saying cloud native to the point doesn't mean anything. To me, cloud native, I think what some people are saying is that there are patterns, software patterns that were born in the cloud, right? So in early days of the cloud, you're having machines that can come and go. You have access to so much APIs, things like IAM, right? This idea that you can have an identity that's different from your username and password and then have attributes, this RBAC model. Most people were not using things like the IAM way of thinking before. So when people come into the cloud, in order to make authentication scalable and have federated identity, they were introduced to some of the things that were born in the cloud, like object stores. People have a concept like, wow, instead of using a POSIX file system, I can use something like S3 or Google Cloud Storage. Those are, in some ways, those are cloud native patterns for thinking about storing data and managing data. So when we say cloud native, I think really what people are saying, there are some patterns that were born in the cloud. And now that we have all this open source software, they allow you to leverage those same patterns pretty much anywhere where computers are. Because like I said earlier, they're just computers for the most part. The managed services are definitely important, but that means the patterns can actually live in other places. So yes, I think the answer there is you can be cloud native without being in the cloud, but please, I hope people don't fool themselves. If you're not giving self-service, if you're not evolving, if you're not giving people APIs to these things and you're just opening tickets, it's not going to feel very cloud native because people are like, this is just a new API on top of the same thing that doesn't work really well.
Yeah, totally agreed on that. So yeah, let's take the next question from Kajidai. So it's good that CNCF landscape project icon seems to be shrinking always. Is there a life cycle mode for the projects? Is any project ever retired?
I don't know the official answer here, but what we see in the real world, right, is that most software projects are never retired. They're abandoned, right? Most people are just going to stop contributing to it. And if you don't pay attention to the last contribution, you might still just use the software because it's still good. Maybe there's no real known security vulnerabilities, or it just runs at a layer that is less likely to have a security vulnerability. I think that's going to probably happen first, is that projects will be abandoned before they're retired. And I think when we start to say something is retired, when it comes to infrastructure, the question is going to be, well, then what replaces it? Right? So it's going to be very hard to retire something that someone is using. Even if a single person is using some software, it's hard to say it's retired. So I think so far, CNCF hasn't been around long enough to retire a project, right? And I think that's good for now, but you're right. I think long-term, we have to think about what happens when a project is no longer needing the assistance of the CNCF, right? Has a project ever left the CNCF? Has it ever been forked? I think we'll see those kind of things before we see an official retirement, because I think the CNCF would have to have a replacement, just like in the cloud. If you want to retire a service in the cloud, it's very hard to do if you have any customers using that product, and those customers are going to want a replacement. So we're not quite there yet because most of these projects are pretty new.
Yeah, thanks, Kelsey. And
So yeah, I'd like to take. Okay, yeah, Raju.
yeah, it's like the exact question I was also thinking about. You tweeted some days ago about like you're using lots of resources for Hello World, referencing the CNCF landscape. So what was the take on that?
Yeah, I think honestly, some of this stuff is really getting out of control, to be honest. So there's a couple of things that are nice. One is that I work at a cloud provider, and I know how many components go into building something like Cloud Run. You know, if you think about building Cloud Run outside, you need things like Kubernetes, Istio, Spire that implements the SPIFFE protocol. You need Prometheus. You need something like Grafana. You need visualization. Then you need a bunch of hardware. You need networking. You need PKI. You need so many components. And traditionally, in industries where it's really hard, like aerospace, the number of people can ever build an airplane or even have an airport is very, very, very small. But in the software business, one nice thing about the CNCF and so many of these projects and the complexity is that in theory, there's enough software there where you can actually probably build a pretty competitive cloud provider and a cloud offering. If you have the right people, the right capital, you actually have a good foundation of software, right? Because if you think about most cloud today, there's a lot of Linux there. There's a lot of open source projects already. So what we're talking about in the CNCF, these are all projects that are required in many ways, at least in the open source, to build all of the things you would need as a full service cloud provider. The problem, though, is that a lot of these projects are starting to take dependencies on these other projects, right? So if you bring in Envoy, and it's not a bad thing, Envoy doesn't have a hard dependency on Open Policy Agent, but it's very clear how you would connect it. So people say, wow, why would I not do the best practice? I can do Envoy. I can call Open Policy Agent to do policies there, and then I can log to Fluentd, and then I can put all the metrics in Prometheus, and then I can actually do Grafana to visualize all of these things, but then I can take Linkerd to do service mesh. Yes, I need all of that for my hello world because I want to be doing it because when people hear best practice, who wants to do worst practice, right? So everyone's saying, I want to do best practice. So then you start doing all of this stuff that even if you don't need, and then it starts to get confusing. Because for me, I just tell people there's no best practice. There's only practice. We're only practicing. So you should only take the components that you'll actually be using to practice. So when you ask someone that is new, they come in and they may read the blog post, and the blog post say, hey, and sometimes it's my fault too, right? I say, hey guys, check out this new thing. I have all the pieces together. Look how amazing. You say, okay, if Kelsey's doing that, let me go do that. And now I'm part of the problem. So I think the biggest thing is we have to educate each other to say, you don't need all of these pieces. And sometimes you're probably just better off just using managed service where the cloud provider is using some of these pieces. Again, use the open interfaces because maybe you don't care about running yourself. But I do think it's important that we can run it ourselves. I'm always going to believe that. Even though I work at a cloud provider, I still think it's important that if I want to run my own or build my own as best as I can, I want that option too.
Yeah. Again, we are having lots of questions, but let me take only few. Can we take your 10 minutes more?
Oh yeah, we can keep going. We'll have fun this morning.
Okay. Okay. So there was like interesting question. So what is it to work in Google, and how was your first day in Google?
So I can tell the story because I worked at Google twice. So there's a long history. You can learn it somewhere else, but when I got out of high school, I didn't spend much time in college at all, maybe a month. And I started my own like consulting business doing like a computer store in Atlanta, Georgia, as a part of the United States. And I decided to go into the workforce, like go and stop being a business owner. Because you got to remember, not all business owners make millions and millions of dollars, right? Like I'm doing okay, but I decided that I wanted to go get a job. And the first job I took was I was a system administrator at Google in the other part of the United States. So not in California, but working inside of a Google data center. And that was a great learning experience because I go into this huge data center. There's lots of servers. I'm learning how to automate things like switches. I'm learning about Pixie booting. I'm basically learning all of the things that you have to do with bare metal to really run at Google scale. And I was able to learn everything from the hardware up, how to deal with power, how to manage power across a large physical data center. And I only had that job for 3 months because I knew that that wasn't where I wanted my career to end. But there were a lot of great system administrators building a lot of good tools, and it really taught me how to think about system administration. It's not just about dealing with some software packages. It's about thinking about everything from the power all the way through the operating system, doing things like burn-in, looking for single memory bit errors, because Google has such huge footprint that they see things like memory corruption. They see things like they have custom hardware that they have to build their own drivers for. So being exposed to that is because Google is so big and so complex that it makes sense for Google to be building custom things. So the second time around though, when I was joining Google, we talked about personal brand. I had already a personal brand. I was known for being this person who had the ability to contribute code, write code, communicate well, and also had the trust of the community. I've earned the ability to be seen as an authentic person in the community. So joining Google the second time, after maybe 15 years or 12 years, going into Google that time, now you kind of have this respect. And at Google, when you start to go to the more senior levels at Google, you really need to be able to influence people and persuade them on different ideas. So lots of smart engineers, they can do and build and solve most complex problems. But there's this other thing about what should we be building, and having all of this enterprise experience, working at banks, working at infrastructure companies, working in different industries, really helped me understand the customer. So in the cloud business, we work really close with other engineers, right? When you use Gmail, you can just use Gmail as a consumer and there's limited interaction unless you need something like support. But for cloud, I'm working with my peers at other companies who are also engineers. So as an engineer building tools for other engineers, you really need to know what it's like to write and build things outside of Google to be successful. So I think internally at Google, depending on what your role is, if you're writing software, we have really great software engineering tools and software practice and discipline. Google has a lot of frameworks, right? We're not just using things like Kubernetes and gRPC. We actually have frameworks that are wrapped around those tools. So when you come into work at Google, it takes a while to learn all of these frameworks, but they're very powerful. A lot of the ideas that you see us write about or tools you see in the open source community, Google's had a lot of that stuff for 15 plus years, maybe even longer in some cases, but they're accessible in the case of write your stubs, use something like gRPC, and there's so much tools around you to make the best practices just kind of built into the platform. And that's the mentality at Google. So it's really a lot to learn, but I'm seeing their outside world also work the same way. So Google isn't the only place to get these ideas, but it's really great to be submerged in the people who've created a lot of them.
So I think in a doc or somewhere I've heard that Google has a kind of mono repo kind of system, not splitting all of those each microservices or each services into each repo. So is that a thing?
That's true, and there's public things about it. But if you think about it, GitHub is a monorepo, right? All of GitHub. GitHub.com, there's a lot of repositories there. So if you think about it, GitHub is a monorepo, and it has really nice tools on top, like search. So Google is very much the same way. We have a bunch of directories. I can start a new project. Maybe it's for cloud. Maybe I go to the cloud directory /app engine /new service. And in that directory, I would put a thing like a README, a owner's file, maybe a license. If it's a third-party software, we have a directory for that. But then what happens is the Google, we call it Google 3. The Google tooling then knows how to do builds. So we use Bazel, or it's called Blaze. But Bazel in the outside world is a tool that knows how to take build definitions across any number of these directories, because you may have dependencies across different things, and generate code or do whatever you need to create binaries. But if you think about it, GitHub is very similar, right? If you're using the Go programming language, then you have tools like Go modules that knows how to go find the various projects on GitHub, bring them in, and build a binary. So it's not really that weird when you think about it, because most Googlers, or at least when I was writing code inside of Google 3, you only think about the few directories you have, and you treat those like repositories. You don't think about it all of code being in one place. You just CD into the directory where you're working, and you do all your code there, and maybe you don't even think about the other directories.
Yeah. So there is one question about the Kubernetes and managed services, because we have like Cloud Run and ECS, and there are lots of managed Kubernetes services, or I would say like managed container services. So what would be a good point for migrating to Kubernetes, like for the startup and maybe for the small businesses? Would it make sense to migrate to Kubernetes, or make sense to use those managed container services?
So let's talk about ECS, right? So ECS has an API. If you think about it, VMs have an API too. You go to the cloud provider, they have some API to say, give me a machine with this much memory, this much CPU, and use this SSH key, and pick this operating system. The machine comes up, and now the contract you have with that machine is SSH and whatever you want to do with it, right? That's kind of the Linux API that you get. And then when you start to talk about ECS, you have to ask yourself, what API do I get? So on Linux, you get systemd, you get journald, you get all these things to kind of interact with your app. You can write unit files. When you do ECS, it also has its own API and contract, right? You can run a container, you can mount some volumes, you can integrate with load balancers, you can integrate with things in the VPC. That's the contract that it gives. But then when you think about Kubernetes contract, you can do things like pods, sidecars, daemon sets, etc. And they're similar in that regard, but Kubernetes has this extension model. And I think this is where Kubernetes starts to separate itself from many other platforms. So in the cloud, typically, most of our compute platforms cannot be extended. Whereas in Kubernetes, we can bring our own emission controller. So that means we can do more than what IAM can do. So IAM may say, this user cannot deploy this app in this namespace. But I can bring Open Policy Agent or any emission controller and just say, okay, I'm going to put even more rules to extend. So Kubernetes is more of this platform that can be extended in a very first-class way. So the contract can actually be changed. So now the second question is, should I just run Kubernetes myself on a bunch of VMs? Well, the truth is, if you think about GKE, for example, it's a lot closer to ECS, right? It's fully managed, even though you can see the nodes. We manage most of the control plane. We manage most things. So it's more about what contract do you want. So if I was a customer, do I want a Linux contract where I bring Puppet Chef, Ansible, Terraform, and all of these tools? Do I want like a Lambda contract where I just give it a code snippet and map events? Or do I want like a Kubernetes contract where I can do things like a cron job, batch job, Kubeflow, and the various other tools that extend the Kubernetes API? I think honestly, for most companies, they're going to end up using multiple of these tools. I use a lot of serverless, but for some things, I use Kubernetes because maybe I need GPU, but they don't allow GPU. Or maybe I want to use a sidecar, and the serverless platform doesn't allow me to use the sidecar. So I think the options are going to be multiple and maybe not just one. But if I only had one, like someone told me I can never do anything but one, then Kubernetes is probably going to be the most flexible as a managed service for me.
Yeah. So the recently released version 1.9. So I would also add to this question, like what are the features you are most excited about version 19 and release, and what are you looking forward for the next version? And also I would like to add on that. So where do you see Kubernetes in like 5 years?
5 years, it will be, I think it will continue its trajectory just like Linux. Linux has been around for a very long time. When I think about Kubernetes, the core of Kubernetes is being refined, right? We did RBAC years ago. We're now doing more specifications around the storage API, CSI. We're making CNI. All of these things are getting better, right? So the core promises Kubernetes makes is run this application in a certain way, make sure that it's extendable, make sure we have good ingrained security. And then most of the things that are changing are to support some of the other extensions, right? For example, we've learned a lot from the service mesh world. So by default, what we have in Kubernetes in terms of networking is okay, but it can be better, right? We don't need to be using IP tables too much anymore, given the fact that there's BPPF, and we can start building things there using some of the kernel modules and features. There's other things around ingress. Ingress is really hard to use. It's great for basic stuff, but once you want to do something more advanced, you have to either use a lot of annotations, or you have to just change products altogether and use something like Istio. I think what we're going to do now is start to rethink some of those APIs, ask ourselves, does it really need to be in core? And if it does, if it's in core, will it support these other use cases better versus having the community start over on everything? So I would say in 5 years, there will be even better managed services. So I think in the future, what you will have, just like with VMs, we don't think about VMware and hypervisors in the cloud, right? You just go, we don't know if they're using KVM. You don't know if they're using OpenStack or Xen. Those are the really good cloud providers that are just saying, here's how you get VMs. We have a nice control plane. You can just use it. At some point, Kubernetes will get there too, where you don't even think about nodes, right? You just go to the API. I think Amazon's Fargate is getting close to that, right? There's just no cluster. You just have Kubernetes API. It's not the full Kubernetes API, so they have a little work to do, but it's heading in the right direction. Some people are going to probably call it serverless Kubernetes. Either way, it doesn't matter. Here's my container, here's my config. You can just run it for me and just take care of auto scaling. Because if you think about it, in VMs, you don't auto scale the machines underneath. You don't auto scale the bare metal. You just auto scale your VMs across zones and regions. That's how containers could work in Kubernetes. There's no need to show people nodes, and they auto scale that layer as well. So in 5 years, you're probably going to have a really great managed Kubernetes offering, and we won't think about Kubernetes like we do now, which is a bunch of clusters running everywhere. There'll be still people doing that, but you won't have to. In 10 years, maybe 15 years, there'll probably be another meeting where people are saying, oh, we got to migrate away from legacy Kubernetes. Kubernetes is so old, it's so legacy. You need to change your mindset. You need to think different because all technology is a good idea until it isn't.
Yeah, and also there was an interesting discussion between us also. So for the Kubernetes with the kubectl, so can we compare like giving the kubectl accesses and doing the kubectl for the development team, like the giving SSH access in the old days? Can you compare in that way?
Yeah, because when you think about the lowest level API to Linux, it is the shell. When we say user space in the Linux world, we are talking about the shell, right? The shell around the kernel. So the access to the shell in the kernel is SSH, right? Secure shell. That's what it is. So we can log in, we authenticate either through username, password, or some key. And now you're into the raw API and you can do anything that that user can do, right? So those permissions allow you to create directories. I can create systemd unit files. I can start them. So SSH is the API in many ways of the shell of Linux. And then we have lots of utilities. I can use CP, I can use cat, I can use the various utilities. That's the API. It's very loose. Everything is a file. But then in the Kubernetes world, our shell is kubectl, right? So the kernel in Kubernetes analogy would be the API server, and the API server basically runs off of configs. Even when you make your own extensions, you still have to have a API layer, a custom resource definition. So when you think about it, if you do nothing else, what is the shell to Kubernetes? Well, the shell to Kubernetes is the API, and kubectl is how we leverage that API. So when you go give it to developers, you're basically doing the same things we used to do with SSH. You're basically saying, I will try to give you some credentials to limit what you can do. But for all intents and purposes, if I give you admin, you can do anything you want to Kubernetes. SSH you can get exec access into a container. You can launch extensions. You can turn things off. You can do a lot of things there. So I think of it as SSH in the modern world. And it's okay because a lot of tools were built on SSH. Like Ansible was a high-level tool that was built on top of SSH that would made it fundamentally different than the other tools, right? So people are now starting to understand that they're going to have to build the Ansible for Kubernetes, where kubectl can be a component or a library towards that bigger tool, the true automation. So Kubernetes is not that tool. Even though Kubernetes, you can get really far because it's very nice, the API, but it is really low level and you need something higher level to express what you really want to do.
Yeah, you said like Kubernetes is just a platform and we can build lots of APIs and tools over it. So let me like do one last wrap up question, and we'll take two questions from the floor. So we have just started a cloud community chapter, and I would say it has a next step, second step in our community building. So for the starting point, so what recommendation would you like to give for keeping the community growing and keep the like energy level high and make it more collaborative? So what will be your suggestion for that?
Yeah, so I've been very fortunate. I've been a part of some very great small communities. So the big communities I'm involved in is of course Kubernetes and CNCF. But I actually appreciated when I was in Atlanta, this other part of the United States. I was in the Python community, and we used to just meet at a very small location. Maybe there's 50 people that go all the time. But what made it nice is we had so many people take turns giving talks, right? The worst thing that can happen is that there's only 5 people giving all the talks every week. It's the same person giving the same talks. That's not going to be very inviting. Like people are going to say, look, I'm kind of tired of the same people giving the same talks. So instead of just sitting in the audience, you have to make sure you're participating. So, I mean, you should participate. It's a good way to build your own networking. It's a good way to teach other people, because my guess is everyone has something of value to add, even if it's just a reminder, like, hey, there's been an update to this particular tool. Let's remind people what the update is. There's different things that you care about. I really, really think that is probably one of the most important things, is just to make sure that you have a nice set of representation from everyone in that community. So one good thing is, let's say you have a Kubernetes meetup, you might want to invite someone from the Nomad community to give a talk at the Kubernetes meetup, because you want to know what Nomad is doing. You want to know if there's any ideas that you can learn from the Nomad community that should exist in the Kubernetes community. So don't build this wall of community that excludes other humans. So there should be a lot of room for you to have different industries, different communities come in to make sure that your community is always growing and is vibrant.
Yeah, thank you. So if anyone wants, because we're a lot more excited for having you, and if anybody wants to ask any question, just feel free. Yeah, Naren.
Hey Kelsey, it's like a pleasure to have you. So I really follow your blogs and posts, and I see that you delve into the first principles before evaluating any tool, and before even presenting a tool, like the philosophy behind it. So can you just share some points, like if you're evaluating a tool, like you even mentioned some, in your journey of your career. Like, so how do you go about evaluating tools for yourself? Of course, I know it depends on the use case, but what's the things beyond just the features and the use cases of tools which you really take into consideration?
Okay, so I'll walk you through some of the service mesh stuff. So early when Istio first came out, I did a little bit of prototypes. I built one of the first injectors for Kubernetes because I knew how a mission controller works. A lot of people on the Istio team were pretty new to Kubernetes. So I was able to say, hey, this is how you would inject the sidecar automatically. I think that prototype is still on GitHub. But I had to learn a lot about Istio. I had to learn even more about emission controllers and give feedback to the team that, hey, the thing I'm trying to do doesn't work well. That's when we had initializers back in the day, and if it was broken, like you can even troubleshoot it because it was hidden because it didn't finish initializing. But today I've been looking at other things. So fast forward 2 years, I'm looking at all of this stuff around identity, JOT token, open policy agent, all the things fundamental to the service mesh. So how do I go about it? So I typically take the long way. First, I try to look at my relevant experience, like when I was doing LDAP and before we had OAuth, how was I doing authentication? How were we passing around sessions and tickets and tokens? And I look at that and just remind myself, okay, here's how we used to do it. These are the fundamentals. Now I'm good and I'm reminded. And now let me go to look at the new thing. So if I look at JOT tokens are pretty easy, right? Like get this library, create JOT token, sign the JOT token. But then I really want to understand why are we even doing this? So then I go read the RFCs. What is the JOT token? Okay, JOT is just this, payload, but then I need JWS to sign it with the signature. Then I say, how do you actually make one from scratch? So maybe I go read a library. So I say, hey, I'm writing Go. Let me go find a JOT library. I read it and say, okay, I like what they're doing. I'm going to write one. Now, this is like, why are you writing the JOT thing? You just said, don't be wasting time, do no code. But here's the thing. If I want to explain it well and be very confident, I have my own JOT library. And now I've read the RFC, kind of looked at their code a little bit and say, I'm going to do things slightly different because I know Go in a slightly different way. I'm going to do my own implementation of JOT, JSW, JWK, so I can actually do all of the pieces required to leverage JOT tokens with Envoy and with Open Policy Agent. So as you notice, I'll look at the high level, ask myself what the fundamentals, go look at some existing implementations. Then I go read the RFC to understand who is involved. Okay, there's Microsoft, there's Google, there's all these people. And you look at it and say, oh, Microsoft added a lot of things from Active Directory in some of these proposals, like around OAuth and how it works. So now I understand the history and the thinking and the prior art. And then when I write the code myself, I stumble across decisions I have to make to implement the RFC. Then I go ask like a security expert in Google, hey, am I thinking about this right? What am I missing? What is the best practice here? And then I'll just create a simple library that only does the best practice and nothing more, maybe not a full implementation. And then I step back even further. So now I spent 2 weeks doing low-level JWT. Now I'm going to learn how to use that implementation inside of Go. And then I'm going to try to configure Envoy to do this with Open Policy Agent, to do this with my app. So then I will write an example app that goes end to end, trying to exercise all the things. And then you'll see me go on Twitter sometimes and say, hey, are people really doing this? Because none of them have been doing this for 1 month. This doesn't seem safe. And then some people will say, yeah, you're right. Part of this isn't safe. It's a trade-off because if you do this, if you do that, then you're making this trade-off. Then I'll go find out how we're doing it at Google. I'll do one-on-ones with other engineers who did the implementation at their company and say, hey, why'd you make these trade-offs? And the last thing that I do is try to figure out, even if it's bad for performance and if it's overkill, I try to figure out what is the exact best we can possibly do. And then I usually write the code to do all of the things end to end, the best possible given the tools here, and then start making trade-offs. So then later on, if you see me do a keynote or you see me ship a feature at Google where I can use this now new knowledge, I'm always given a demo that's very end to end. It looks simple because I've spent months refining the process of me understanding to the point where I can start from either nothing and go all the way to the best, and then take away just a little to say this is what people are actually doing. But now that I have the code, now that I have the workflow, now that my code is looking super simple because I wrote it all from scratch, then it feels like I really understand it. So that's my process.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great insight. And Nurin, thanks for the question. And as a wrap up, I just want to ask you, have you heard about Nepal earlier?
I mean, I kind of know where it sits geographically. I've been to many countries. I've never been to Nepal. I've never been to India, but I've pretty much been to every other country in the world once or twice. We were planning to come to Bangalore this year before COVID lockdown. So Google now has expanded in a lot of these other regions. So we'll be expanding, at least my travel. I will be visiting some of the communities there. So maybe we can figure out how to get there at some point.
Yeah, sure. Because, frankly saying, while you accepted our request for joining, the same night I saw the dream of receiving you at our airport. So I hope that will be kind of deja vu at some time. Yeah.
I think we will make it happen. I mean, my goal is to go to every country if I can help it. And what better way to go and talk about and work with people in the area that I'm interested in.
Yeah, that will be more interesting, and we will always free for you for inviting you. And yeah, thank you for managing time for the community, and thank you all for joining. And yeah, thanks a lot, Kelsey, for uh, being presenting and giving your time for this in your early morning. So yeah, have a
Awesome. All
good
right.
day.
Bye.
Have a good day and stay safe. Bye bye.
Hey, thanks, guys.